So we're continuing our conversation in translations. Last week we set up a lot of groundwork for translations, and this week we are going to be actually talking about physical translations. So I just wanted to um, start things off with a quick review. I want to point out, just to remind you of a couple terms. We've got the Masoretic text, which is the Hebrew text of the Old Testament put together by the Masoretic Jews, a group of rabbis who were dedicated to getting rid of the mistakes and imperfections in Scripture that had made their way in during the Babylonian captivity. Then you've got the Textus Receptus, which is done by Erasmus. It's the first all-Greek translation of the Bible, and it uses, it was done somewhat in a rush, and had a number of mistakes at the time, went through a number of revisions, and is also used as a form of textual criticism. You've got the majority method, which basically looks at the most used translation of any of the original manuscripts and says that's the most correct. You have the Textus Receptus that goes off of what the Textus Receptus says as the most correct, and then you also have the one that is eclectic, which looks at a number of factors such as what could explanations be for why this translation is the way it is, how could this have come about, how many times does this occur in various manuscripts, and what manuscripts do they occur in. And so, for example, a big part of the eclectic method is understanding that the Byzantine manuscripts are some of the most frequent version, most frequently found original Greek manuscripts. However, they are all pretty identical, and they all come off about 4 or 5-ish original manuscripts. So they really represent only about 5. So with the eclectic method in mind, we find ourselves with the Nestle Aland Greek translation, and the Nestle Aland is what many major Bible translators use today for their Greek translation. So I just want to put those names right back out in front of you as we go into this lesson. And this is why these important, we've spent some time talking about the source material, because as we talk about these English translations, I'm going to point out where they got their translation from. It's important because we want you to, I want you to know and understand how your Bibles got to be the way that they are. So when it comes to our current Bible translations, you have to understand that there is a spectrum that they fall on. And so I want to show you a diagram here. And this diagram shows you types of Bible translations. We're going to talk about it, but you essentially have 3 Bible big translation types. And it's word for word, thought for thought, and paraphrase. And they fall on a spectrum. There's not a definitive line between them. This is the general, they show a few on here as far as just that are good examples of what each of those categories are and where they would generally speaking fall on the spectrum, but there are far more translations than that, and they also fall all over the spectrum. So these are just some big hitters. We'll talk about some of them, but what I do want to point out to you is that this, when it comes to translations, there is a spectrum. Let's talk about the differences, and we'll start with word for word, and we'll make our way through to paraphrase. We'll give you some examples and everything. So word for word translations are the most literal from the original language, but in order to be literal, they do sacrifice some readability. And so Hebrew doesn't always translate to English in an easy to read fashion. It in fact can be quite hard. The syntax or word order can be very complicated sometimes. The words that they choose don't always make sense to us, or we don't use them any longer. And so it can be hard to understand when you translate identically or word for word. A thought for thought translation, it changes up the word order to make it a little more understandable to the average English speaker. Sometimes they'll replace words or add words even so that you can have a clarification for what is actually being said, and so there are situations where it is not as close to the original text, but they're going for a more readable translation that's easier to just comprehend and understand. But you miss out on a lot of the word for word benefits that come from it. There's a lot that is lost in translation when you move further and further you move away from a word for word. You miss word patterns, you miss some of the poetry, you miss a number of different things when you move away from word for word. But there are things you gain as an English speaker, and that's kind of what the concept is, and the mindset that each translator has to kind of intentionally choose to pursue. So thought for thought looks at sentences, tries their best to translate the thoughts. That's why it's called thought for thought. Paraphrase translations take this a step further, and they ignore the word order and instead rewrite the language with heavy emphasis on readability. And so they are going to really take the thought for thought and simplify it even more basic, a lot less depth there, but much easier to read. Typically more readable by younger people. So these often can lead to translation. This often can lead to translation errors or missed details and lost patterns in the text. So you have to understand what you're getting the further you go into paraphrase. So this leaves us with the question, what translation should you use? Well, in your study of the Bible, you should use a combination of at least word for word and thought for thought. If you choose to include paraphrase, that's your choice, and you're welcome to do that. Just do so carefully. But you should not just pick one translation. That is going to be, I'm getting to the point early, but what I'm going to say is you do not pick just one translation. What I want you to do is use a variety of translations. And if you've been following along in the reading plan, you can see the benefit of doing this. And I want you to know that there is a distinct benefit of doing this. As you've read in the reading plan, you'll find that you might have started off in a thought for thought and moved towards a word for word, and it really helps clarify the word for word. When you're just struggling to understand the basic gist of a passage, jump to a word for word translation. It's fantastic for it. If you are just needing some easy reading as you go and are not trying to dig incredibly deep, like actual real studying, but you're just trying to spend time with God, word for word may not always be what you want to do. Thought for thought might be better. Use a combination. Have a combination. Don't just go for one translation and die on that hill that is the only translation. There are a lot of good translations. Many of them use the same manuscripts. But use and alternate a variety of translations. It's so important for you. When you struggle to understand a Bible passage or just new at reading the Bible, thought for thought translations can be excellent for you. If you're a new believer, if you are trying to get in the habit of reading your Bible, thought for thought may be a great option for you to jump in and start reading. Word for word can be a little more overwhelming, harder to understand. So, some reasons to choose from all those. When you get the more accurate translation or dive deep into a passage, when you want to get really deep, word for word's great. There's a lot of word patterns and things that they use and repeat words that get lost in thought for thought translations or paraphrase. And so word for word keeps a little closer to that because it's being more accurate to the translation. Now, you will be able to see patterns and literary techniques much more readily when you spend time in those word for word. So I really encourage you, spend time in a variety of translations. There's a variety of uses for them. So I want to give you some examples. Let's actually talk about translations. And so let's start with word for word. Interlinear is going to be the most literal that you get, and that's because they're not really a translation. They are literally as word for word as you can get. And when these are for when you really want to get nerdy, I use one. That's mainly because it's the only way I could get deeper is to actually learn Hebrew and Greek, and I don't know that, and right now I don't have the time to do that. And so interlinear is a great option for me. They're difficult to read, but they can really help unlock patterns in scripture that the authors are using. And so an interlinear is going to have, you'll see the Hebrew text in actual Hebrew characters, and then above it, uh, each word will have the direct English translation, and it will be in weird syntax, and it will be really hard to follow, and it can be very tough. But there are some really cool patterns you can get out of it. You can really dive deep. Mine has Strong's Concordance numbers, which we'll talk about in another lesson, but basically these are numbers that you correspond to a concordance done by a guy named Strong. And um, it's one of the best, one of the most standard Greek Greek and Hebrew concordances you can get. So you can look up in the concordance exactly where that word is used elsewhere in the Bible, exactly how it's used, what its various meanings are, what its root words are, etc., etc. So super nerdy. Interlinear translations, awesome. A little harder to get. There's some apps that you can get it on, some websites you can get it on as well, but they are not for everybody. I personally love mine, but that's because I'm a Bible nerd. I enjoy being in spending time in it. As far as real translations are concerned, about as word for word as you can get in your standard translation is the NASB. Um, and the NASB, it's one of the most common of the word for word translations. A lot of people use it. A lot of people in our church use it. You will see a number of different NASBs. I read them sometimes. The NASB, it relies on the Masoretic text and the Nestle Aland translation. Sorry, this typo there. Nestle Aland translation as its primary source text. But the NASB it can be rather clunky to read. It comes in at about an 11th grade reading level. So it can be harder to understand at times. You have to go a little slower through it. You're not just going to fly through it as easily. Now, there are two different versions. There's a 1995 and a 2020 version. So there's a recent translation of the NASB. The 1995 edition tends to be a little harder to read. The 2020 edition is slightly more readable and it uses more gender-neutral language, but only where it's clear that the Bible is referring to people as a whole. So let me give you an example, because this is actually a hot-button topic in the translation world. For example, when an author or a speaker uses the Greek word brothers and is clearly referring to women as well as men, they'll say, and sisters, brothers and sisters. I write to you today about this. You see that in Paul's letter somewhere. He say, brothers, I write to you, so on and so forth. And so they will say, add in, and sisters. And so it's added in italics. And if you're reading the translation, you'll see it in italics, and that's noting that it is added for, it is not in the original manuscript. This is something added for clarity, but it is not part of the original manuscript. So what I'm going to do as we go through is I just picked a verse in the Bible, and you're going to see the same verse over and over again. There's no real significance to this verse as far as this lesson is concerned. This is just an example verse. I wanted to show you the same example verse over and over again, so you had something to compare each of the translations to. So 1 Corinthians 1:21, this is the 1995 version. You'll see the difference. There's really hardly even a difference at all between these two versions here. But for since in the wisdom of God, the world, through its wisdom, did not come to know God, God was well pleased through the foolishness of the message preached to save those who believe. NASB 1995. 2020 says, for since in the wisdom of God, the world, through its wisdom, did not come to know God, God was pleased through the foolishness of the message preached to save those who believe. And so it is very, very, very close. It is, let me see if I can find the difference here. Come to know God. God was pleased through the foolishness of the message, rather than God was well pleased through the foolishness of the message. That's the difference. And so again, that well-pleased term is an older term. Pleased is a much more, it means the same thing. We're not using well-pleased. So this is one of those situations where the translators just updated the language a little bit. So another translation in the word for word is the ESV translation. ESV is a relatively word-for-word translation that is easier to read than the NASB most of the time. It's quite a popular Bible right now in a lot of churches, and it relies also on the Masoretic text and the Nestle Aland translation as its primary source text. I like that typo this time around. And so the Nestle Aland translation is one of its primary texts. These are the two, same as the last one. It's going to read at about 9th or 10th grade reading level, so somewhere in between there. So a little easier, not much. So let me read you an example. 1 Corinthians 1:21. For since in the wisdom of God the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. So a little difference there. Again, kind of awkward to read at times, but much more word for word. So a little slightly less awkward translation, but still kind of up there as far as that's concerned. Now we have the KJV, the King James Version. This is one of the older translations, and it relies on the Masoretic text and the Textus Receptus for its translations. And so it is it's something that's going to rely on these two. It is Textus Receptus, as we talked about, was done by Erasmus. And this is one of the main versions, and the people who are big proponents for KJV will tell you that it is largely because of the Textus Receptus. It reads at above a 12th grade reading level, so it is hard to read. It uses a lot of old language, very old language, but it is the Bible of choice for many people who view the Textus Receptus to be more accurate, or the most accurate, so it's very heavily preferred by that group. The KJV has undergone a lot of versions. Most people who will argue for the KJV will argue for the 1611 KJV. They have probably never read a 1611 KJV and probably could not if they tried. There's even a version though before the 1611, and that is the 1534 Tyndale translation. So if you're ready to see this verse in the very oldest KJV you can, you probably will not even recognize some of these words or the spelling. For when the world thorough wisdom knew not God any wisdom of God, it pleased God thorough foolishness of preaching to save them yet believe. I don't even know how to pronounce properly some of those spellings, but this is the 1534 William Tyndale translation of the KJV. This is the original KJV right here. 1611, the one that you'll hear a lot about, is also pretty odd. For after that, in the wisedom of God, the world by wisdom knew not God. It pleased God by the foolishness of preaching to save them that believe. I'm guessing they swapped the V for the U there. It's another version, 1769. It's getting a little better, but for after that, in the wisdom of God, the world by wisdom knew not God. It pleased God by the foolishness of preaching to save them that believe. Much better. Big leap in understandability. Then we have the 1987 KJV, which is what most people that you will interact with today are reading, that are reading the true KJV. After that, in the wisdom of God, the world by wisdom knew not God. It pleased God by the foolishness of preaching to save them that believe. Now, the NKJV is also what a lot of people you interact with are reading, and it's a more modern version of the KJV with updated language. It also relies on the Masoretic text and Textus Receptus for its translation. It's much easier to read. It reads more at a 9th grade reading level, which I'm not sure if I agree with that or not. I do believe it reads a little harder than that, but that is what the standard assumption is of it. So, it is closer to the thought for thought spectrum than the KJV is. And let me read for you the same passage. It's a little easier to read. For since, in the wisdom of God, the world through wisdom did not know God, it pleased God through the foolishness of the message preached to save those who believe. Now, I will say, this is a great option if you want to read KJV, if you want to use Textus Receptus, want to have a little better, easier to read. It's what you'll hear Alan reading from in sermons. I will say, though, I am actually a big proponent for the next translation. Many of you probably have not heard of it. But I have read all through it. I like this one a lot. You'll see me carry this one to church a lot. And that is the MEV, the Modern English Version. This is a much more readable version than the KJV and NKJV, but it relies on the same version. So it is Textus Receptus as well. It's a much more modern translation, begun in 2005, finished in 2014. And so for those who believe Textus Receptus is the most accurate translation, but struggle with the readability, the KJV and NKJV, MEV is a great option. It was actually written, the translation process was begun by military chaplains who were looking for a easier to understand version of the KJV. And it proceeded into a much bigger project than that. And it maintains a more word-for-word translation while also being easier to read. In fact, it is a little more word-for-word even than the NKJV. They do say it reads at an 11th grade reading level. I personally find this, maybe it's just because of the modern updated language, easier to read than the NKJV. So again, I'm not sure I agree with this here. They have reasons they grade it this way. But let me read for you it here. For since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not know God, it pleased God through the foolishness of preaching to save those who believe. It's a very easy to read one. I like it on Sundays because of the fact that we read out of the NKJV for church, because it is from the same manuscripts. The word order is very similar. And so it's very easy for me to follow along to what Alan is reading or in my own translation without getting lost in weird word order differences or anything like that. And so it's very easy for me to use on Sundays. I love my MEV. Great option for you. I'm a big proponent for it. If you're going within the Textus Receptus, this is my personal favorite. CSB, Christian Standard Bible. CSB kind of bridges the gap between a word-for-word translation and a thought-for-thought translation. It is the more recent version. There was an older HCSB, which many people liked, and then CSB is the most recent version. It's kind of hard to find an HCSB now. It relies on the Masoretic text and the Nestle Aland translations as its primary source text, so we're away from Textus Receptus here. It reads at about a 7th or 8th grade reading level. Let me read for you the same passage from here. For since in God's wisdom the world did not know God through wisdom, God was pleased to save those who believe through the foolishness of what is preached. And so CSB, great option for you if you're interested in something a little easier to read, but still not wanting to keep more in the word for word. CSB is a great option. It's what you'll hear a lot of Lifeway Bible studies will use the CSB. It's a Lifeway is, I believe, who put on the translation, so they use it a lot in their material. NIV, New International Version. It's a great thought-for-thought translation. This is what I personally read out of in my daily devotions a lot of the time. It's my personal Bible. When you see me with my beat-up Bible, it's my NIV. It relies on the Masoretic text and the Nestle Aland translations as its primary source text, and it reads at an 8th grade reading level. It's much easier to read. This is not a thought-for-thought or a word-for-word. This is a thought-for-thought translation, though. 1 Corinthians 1:21, for since in the wisdom of God the world through its wisdom did not know him, God was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached to save those who believe. Now, here is my caveat with the NIV. It has two versions, the 1984 and the 2011. I recommend the 1984, although it is harder to find. It is much harder to find, but the 1984 version I strongly recommend. 2011 version I actually would strongly caution you about. And let me explain why. So the changes between the two were actually very controversial. They decided to use much more gender-neutral language, but it was not like with NASB recently. It's actually to the point that they changed the meaning of some passages and almost took more of a political stance with how they translated pronouns and words referring to God. They were a lot more aggressive about the gender-neutral language. And so because of this, there were definitely some issues. So, for example, Psalm 8:4 in the 1984 reads, what is man that you are mindful of him, the son of man that you care for him? Now listen to how the 2011 reads, because this is a very key example here. What is mankind that you are mindful of them, human beings that you care for them? Now, I want you to pay attention. What is the big difference here? Human beings versus the Son of Man. Psalm 1984 says Son of Man. 2011 just says human beings. It's very gender neutral language. If you're not paying attention or you don't know the verse, you would gloss right over that. But this is a bigger deal than just what gender is being said here. This has actually nothing to do with that in the sense of why it's a big deal. This is a big deal because the fact that the term Son of Man is a term Jesus uses to refer to himself. So to change it to human beings entirely removes the messianic implications of that verse. When I say messianic, what I mean are it's like pointing towards Jesus, the Messiah. And so it's a big deal to translate things that way. I definitely want to caution you against that because this is one example. You can find people who have lots more examples for you. But when you translate with an agenda, that becomes a problem. So that's my caveat. 1984 is excellent. 2011, they made a lot of changes. I could talk to you more about it, but that's kind of what my caution is. If you can use a 1984, absolutely use it. That's what I use. Now, most Bible apps, though, are going to use 2011. And so you have to be much more cautious with that. So, anyway, that's my caveat for that. That brings us to the NLT, New Living Translation. Now, this is Kate's personal favorite. This translation bridges the gap between thought for thought and paraphrase. It relies on the Masoretic text and the Nestle Aland translation as its primary source texts. So it reads between a 6th and a 7th grade reading level. Much, much easier to read the Bible in. Let me read for you an example here. Since God in his wisdom saw to it that the world would never know him through human wisdom, he has used our foolish preaching to save those who believe. So this translation is excellent for new believers. It's great for first read-throughs of Scripture or to help clarify really hard to understand passages when you're sitting there like, I just don't understand what's happening here. And you want to clarify, this is a great translation to get the idea, actually understand what the passage is saying, what the gist of the passage is. It does, however, lose a lot of accuracy that's found in the word-for-word translation as a trade-off for readability. That means that if you really want to dive deep into Scripture, the NLT should be used very sparingly, or it should be accompanying a more word-for-word translation. I want to emphasize, this is a good translation. There is actually nothing wrong with the NLT, but when it comes to deep translation or using it as your main primary translation, I actually would strongly discourage use of the NLT as a primary translation unless you are actively using another translation with it. To Kate's credit, as I record this lesson, I can look over and see that she's sitting here with two different Bibles sitting on top of each other that she uses for her devotions. When you go into her devotions, you see that she often, if you walk in while she's doing them, you'll see she's got multiple Bibles open. She does not just use the NLT. So I think it's important to defend her in that, and I do think that that is a good way to use it. Just, Mike, I want you to be cautious in that you need to understand it does move further from the word for word by a good bit, which means you will lose accuracy in translation. Now, if you really want to go off base and far from the word for word, this is where you get the message. I bring this up not as a recommendation, but because it is a popular translation and I want to reference it. The Message became very popular in the early 2000s. It is, however, a paraphrased translation, and a distinctly paraphrased translation. This means that it is so much less accurate than even thought-for-thought translations. You go to the NIV versus the Message, you're going to have drastically different feeling. Often the meaning of verses is even changed. I find when reading the Message, the number of times I will see a verse or hear a verse quoted, and I'm like, I don't recognize that verse. I've never heard that verse before. That's really cool. Let me look that up. And I look it up and realize that this was the Message they were reading from. And in fact, that verse says nothing like what was quoted to me. That's my experience with the Message. It does rely on the Masoretic text and the Nestle Aland translation as its primary source text. It reads at a 4th or 5th grade reading level. Now, because of the way it works, you actually cannot just find one verse at a time. They bundle verses together. So what you're about to read is the same passage, but they've bundled in verses 18 through 21 together. So, but just hear how it reads. You'll understand what I mean in a minute. The message that points to Christ on the cross seems like sheer silliness to those hell-bent on destruction, but for those on the way of salvation, it makes perfect sense. This is the way God works, and most powerfully as it turns out. It is written, I'll turn conventional wisdom on its head and I'll expose so-called experts as shams. So where can you find someone truly wise, truly educated, truly intelligent in this day and age? Hasn't God exposed it all as pretentious nonsense? Since the world, in all its fancy wisdom, never had a clue when it came to knowing God, God in his wisdom took delight in using what the world considered stupid preaching, of all things, to bring those who trust him into the way of salvation. So, that last part there is the verse that we're referring to. That is very distinctly different. You just hear the sound. Now, I do have a friend who's spent a long time as a worship pastor. I trust him a lot. And he will tell you time and time again, whenever we've talked about the message can be good for songwriting when it comes to worship songs because of how it simplifies it and the need for simple lyrics with worship songs. That does not mean you should not be cautious with it, even in those situations, because it is not a very good translation. You also may hear another more popular recent one is the Passion Translation. That is also distinctly a paraphrase, very similar to the message. Now, those are all the examples I'm going to give you. There's lots more examples out there. There's lots of other good translations out there. We have more than just the ones that I mentioned today. Where can you find all these translations? Because owning lots of hard copies of them, while it's a great option, uh, and they often come with great study Bibles, you have to understand that Bibles tend to be expensive, and not everybody can feasibly own as many Bibles as Kate and I do. We own so many partially because Kate worked for Lifeway and she got a lot free or at discounts. And so um, Bibles, it's great if you can get a good Bible, get it. Even if it's a different translation, get it. It's great to have. It's fantastic to have. Um, but do not, even if you just have a Bible that if somebody ever needs one, sometimes we'll give away Bibles because we have so many of them. Um, so get Bibles as you can. But if you are on a budget or you can't afford Bibles or don't have a ton of them right now, you can still access the multitude of translations through Bible apps, Bible Gateway, Bible.com. This is, we'll talk about different apps that you can use, but you can find um, a lot of different translations on your apps, Bible websites. They're very accessible to you that way. So that's kind of if you just want to start experimenting with some of these translations, use your app alongside of whatever your hard copy Bible is. It's a great way to really look and check between translations, see the differences. I will say if you're reading through multiple translations and you are noticing that one phrase keeps changing over and over again, odds are good that's a hard to translate phrase. May even be worth looking up what the actual Hebrew or Greek word is and how it's used there, because there may be some areas that the translators were struggling with that word. So all that to say, use lots of translations. Use them all. Combine them. Hopefully this gives you something to go off of. This is why you have so many, and this is how you can utilize them to help you understand the Bible better. As always, if you have questions, you can reach out to me. Let me know if you have any questions.